Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this session of Free Science in a Free Society. We have with us guest today, Dr. Vandana Shiva, who was also with us here in Pari in June. So it's an honor to have you back with us, Vandana. It's wonderful. She is an Indian scholar, activist, and author. She holds a PhD in physics and has written more than 20 books, including Making Peace with the Earth, Staying Alive, Monocultures of the Mind, Soil Not Oil, and Stolen Harvest. Based in Delhi, she is referred to as Gandhi of Grain for her activism associated with anti-GMO movement. Shiva is one of the leaders and board members of the International Forum on Globalization and a figure of anti-globalization movement. She has received numerous international awards, such as the John Lennon Yoko Ono Grant for Peace, Sydney's Peace Prize, Calgary's Peace Prize, and the Right Livelihood Award, which is regarded as the alternative Nobel Prize. She will be in conversation today with Àlex Gómez-Marín, director of the Pari Center. He is a Spanish physicist turned neuroscientist, and since 2016 has been head of the Behavior of Organisms Laboratory at Alicante, where he is an associate professor of the Spanish Research Council. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Àlex. Welcome.
Thank you, Eleanor. I feel I'm in really good company with all of you and with Vandana. Truly an honor to be again in conversation with you, Vandana. Thank you for accepting this invitation.
My pleasure. And it's good to be back in Paris now through Zoom.
Yes. All right. I'll make a brief intro and then we'll have a conversation, which is a very productive and profound way of figuring things out. So bear with me. So this is a special event, and these are occasions, these are opportunities that one must seize as good excuses to reckon, to just pause and reflect on things that are very important, sometimes forgotten, maybe suppressed, I don't know. And celebration is always a good excuse to invite to rethink. We did it last year with Galileo at 400. And this year, we thought we could do it with Paul Feyerabend when we realized that this year is the Centennial. It's 100 years since Paul Feyerabend, who was this Austrian philosopher of science, was born. He was born in January 13, 1924, 100 years ago. And he died 30 years ago in February 11, 1994. So Feyerabend, this is not a lecture on Feyerabend, but I want to read a couple of paragraphs from him. So Feyerabend is famous for his book Against Method. It's a series of lectures turned into a book published in 1975. He then published Science in a Free Society, which inspired the title of this conversation we're going to have today. This is the book. And then other books like Farewell to Reason and so on. So let me read you first, very, very briefly, how in this book, Science in a Free Society, published 3 years after Against Method, Feyerabend tells us what he did or what he attempted in Against Method. So for you to be on board, in case you've never read Feyerabend. So he says, Against Method grew out of lectures I gave at the London School of Economics and University College London. And a little bit down, a few lines below, he says, my aim in these lectures was to show that some very simple and plausible rules and standards, this is key, rules and standards, which both philosophers and scientists regarded as essential parts of rationality, well, those rules and standards were violated in the course of episodes. And then Feyerabend in brackets mentions the Copernican revolution, the triumph of the kinetic theory, the rise of quantum theory, and so on. And he continues, in the course of episodes, they regarded, the philosophers and the scientists, they regarded as equally essential. More specifically, and these are the 2 lines that he gives us summarizing Against Method, more specifically, I tried to show, A, that the rules or standards were actually violated, he emphasizes that, and that the more perceptive scientists were aware of those violations, first point, those rules, sure, that thing we call the method, they were historically violated, and some scientists were aware of that. And the second point is very important, and I continue to quote, and B, they had to be violated. Insistence on the rules would not have improved matters, it would have arrested progress. So that's why he has this bad fame of kind of the science, philosopher of science anarchist, who says anything goes. And he explains that he doesn't really mean anything goes. He explains carefully that if you buy this idea that there's kind of a reason, a rationality, whose rules and standards you can only obey, and you're blind to what has actually happened in the history of science, then you're an ignorant in philosophy of science as well. And that's why he was called by some the worst enemy of science, being at the same time one of the most important philosophers of science of the past century, together with Kuhn and Popper and Lakatos. Okay, that's against method. Now, let me read you a couple more things and then we'll go into it. In Science in a Free Society, the first page says something, because so far so good. We could say, okay, we reflect on the history of science, but what I'm going to read you now, it doesn't feel so comfortable, even to scientists, even to me, maybe even to you. So this is the first, the summary that appears in the first page of Science in a Free Society. It says, in the first part of the book, Feyerabend launches a sustained and irreverent attack on the prestige of science in the West. It's like, all right, are we going to start throwing stones on our roof? Then he says, the lofty authority of the expert claimed by scientists, he argues, is incompatible with any genuine democracy and often merely serves to conceal entrenched prejudices and divided opinions within the scientific community itself. So, maybe later I can read you a couple more parts. So what's at stake here? There are a few elephants in the room, One is, what is that thing we call science? And he asks here later, like we must ask two questions. What is science and what's so great about it? Rather than just taking it for granted. So what is science? What's that thing we call the scientific method? And what's the role of the expert? And, you know, Feyerabend was writing this many years ago. What would he say today in the age of experts telling us what to do? And he also made it very explicit. He says, well, in the same way that we've managed to separate the state and religion, perhaps we should also do the same with science and the state. What he's saying there, I gather, is let's be very careful with the authority of these so-called experts using science as the only way to tell what's true, discarding other ways of knowing. And so what does that do to democracy and to a free society? So these are all the elements I want to put on the table. And who better than Vandana Shiva, who I consider kind of an embodiment. I told you this when you were in Paris in June, like you're an embodiment of consciousness for real, a scientist who has left the ivory towers of in theory and reason only. And as Feyerabend says here, there's this tension between reason and practice. And, you know, what we're told in theory about reason often doesn't work in practice and does a lot of violence on the world and on us human beings. And so with this, I'll hand it over to you, Vandana, and we can just start whatever you want, having these elephants, call them on stage and say, well, what do we do with this?
So, you know, my relationship with science was first just seeking what I felt were the way things work. That's why I chose, you know, went deeper and deeper and deeper into the foundations of quantum theory. And at that point, it was about freedom, yeah? It was about seeking your way, you know, your way as a human being on this planet with everything that's gone in the background, the brilliant minds that shaped quantum theory. And I did that in Canada and I came back. And, you know, I'm so happy, particularly happy to be here with the Paris Center, because the entire, the dialogues at the Puri Center come, around Bohm and the thinking around quantum theory. I came back to India, and so many things didn't make sense. So I said, okay, I'm going to take some time off. It's basically about intellectual inquiry. And I said, 100 years, same debates have taken place, and nothing will change in 3 years' time. But let me understand this relationship of science and society. Because we're always told the more Western science there is, the richer countries get. And yet, when I came back to India after my PhD, I was already involved in the equality movement. But everywhere, the communities would be responding to experts saying something, and the communities were presenting a different knowledge. And it became so clear to me that, there's one knowledge that is driving the destruction and driving the hierarchy of knowing, There's some people, the experts who Feyerabend mentioned, and then the people who live their practice with their knowledge, and are deep knowers. And very fast, I realized, the world is framed differently through the practice of life and the practice of those who've been put on the pedestal by this mystical thing called the scientific method. We were never taught scientific method while we were studying physics. We never had a class on scientific method. We just did science, We did science in whichever way we were taught, in whichever discipline we were taught. And, the experts were saying the forests are timber mine. The women I worked with in Chipko were saying, no, they're sources of soil and water and pure air. And it just went on in everything, in water, in dams, in agriculture. And we can talk more about those details. And so I wrote a book called Staying Alive to try and understand where does this thinking come from? That there's some people who are experts and scientists, and there's something called a scientific method. Where did it come from? And what is it? And so I went to the roots of it. Of course, on the one hand, there's Descartes, but Descartes never really, entered our part of the world. Science entered our part of the world through Bacon, or at least the mechanical philosophy of Bacon. I just want to share with you what I wrote in this book at that time, trying to understand how do some people see the world as a machine? How do they, define torture and violence as the way to know? And I remember, I never did biology because the first class of biology was chop up a cockroach. And, it was oozing stuff. And I said, no, this is not for me. I'm safer with the equations. So Bacon was both the chief, he was the Chancellor of England and was in charge of the finances. At the time, the East India Company was colonizing the world. But he was also the head of the Inquisition, and for him getting knowledge out of the peasants, he had to torture out of those who had been declared witches. It was torture. Torture was his way, So he defined torture as the way to get the secrets out of nature. And he's written it in his book, in 2 books, 2 very books. One was kind of the book on the future of the world, where he defined ideal societies ruled by experts. But the other one, he wrote a book called The Birth of Modern Science, or Birth of Masculine Science, which is treated as the birth of modern science. Interestingly, the Royal Society was created, and this is what the secretary announced, with the intention to raise a masculine philosophy, whereby the mind of man may be ennobled with the knowledge of solid truths. So till that time, we had truths and multiple paths to truth. And now we had solid truth. You had a scientific method to get to the objective facts and reality. And I think that's what Feyerabend is saying. It doesn't work that way. Kuhn taught us that paradigms shape the facts that you look for. Even quantum theory tells us the way you observe and measure, you find either a particle or a wave. Yeah. You can't say the wave is the fact and the particle is the fact. You can't say that. Now, all this was fitting into actually civilizational, it wasn't just there were other sciences in Europe. People have talked about the other mind of Europe, the sciences of interconnection. So the first director of the Royal Society was Boyle. And Robert Boyle said that to venerate nature and to call nature, to have a reverence for nature, it discourages the impediment to the empire of man over lesser creatures. So you didn't just create an hierarchy of knowledge between experts and the rest as not knowing anything, but you then created the anthropocentric hierarchy between inferior creatures. Yeah. And so I think what Feyerabend contributed, so I read a guest method in those periods of trying to solve this puzzle. Where does this one monolith system come from? And where does it get its legitimacy? Because that for me, Indian Ayurveda system is one of the most ancient and time-tested, and it works. When nothing else works, people go to Ayurveda. I was called by the first Ayurvedic college, because earlier we had learning of Ayurveda, but always with the Ved, and you lived as an apprentice. But then the British tried to criminalize it as unscientific. And that is not stopping even now. I have such fun, and I'm called to address Ayurvedic congresses. There's always a group of people who got a grant to use the scientific method to verify Ayurveda. But the problem is Ayurveda is about a system and a living system. The scientific method is breaking things into parts and trying to find, one cause, one effect. And it doesn't work that way in systems change. So I think the implications at that time, but today are even more. And that's why I like the title you gave, Science Democracy, and Post-Truth. Because I think anyone who's living today with consciousness and alertness will realize, whether the news or it's the political propaganda, we're drowned in post-truth. And the hammer that is used for you to accept post-truth without question is this elevation of experts and a science which I don't call science, but simple, as a scientist, science is to know. It is to know. A system that chops up a living system and says this part is all that matters because this part I can exploit. It doesn't let you know the system. And therefore, there's more ignorance than science. And I think the reason all this is coming together even more now, Feyerabend would see ahead. But I think now, with the whole last 30 years of, Elena talked about my role in resisting globalization, is basically what's the edifice of science, which had its problems anyway that Feyerabend mentioned. That edifice of science has totally merged with the corporate edifice. And today, the experts are the corporate experts. And any independent scientist who does real work to say, no, genes are not the master molecule in a machine. Living systems are self-organized complex systems. If they get noticed, they get hounded. It's fascinating. I mean, in my work on biotechnology, I've seen the top scientists, top scientists hounded. I mean, my own work on biosafety, my own work on monitoring what happened to Indian peasants with BT cotton, shown me that. So I think it's not just that it violates science, as he says, but it violates democracy. It violates basic living conditions of a free society.
This way of practicing science is arguably unscientific, and yet we have this knot that we must untie urgently, I would say, because on the one hand, I don't want to, I mean, I'm really speaking from my current confusion about things. Really, I don't have this figured out. We need some sort of expert, some sort of authority, or maybe we could call it experiential knowledge, expertise. We need people who know about certain things, right? Like if I had surgery, for instance, I had surgery 3 years ago. I want somebody who's trained and good at doing that, right? That saved my life. But at the same time, as you're saying, and as Feyerabend is, I think, saying, and I also think so, there's so many ideological things said and done in the name of science falsely. So it's like there's this hybrid, there's this monster. Science still has many virtues. That's why we're not enemies of science. But at the same time, it has become something sometimes unrecognizable to itself. And so there seem to be two camps, those who are pro and those who are against. And there's no possibility of a subtle discussion about the blind spots, even just the blind spots of this beautiful tool called scientific reasoning. Now, you have a lot of expertise and success in sitting people in tables and inviting them to just pause and work together beyond their dogmatic ideologies. But how is this done? How do we save what's great about science without just selling the whole package to other people's interests who will use science on their behalf?
I think we have to bring democracy and knowledge together, because when whatever, there's no book that says this is the scientific method. The only book I could find was what Bacon was trying to teach, and the institutions that were created around him. And then it was standardized. I think we have to, just like in South Africa, people refuse to accept the apartheid based on hierarchies of race. I think to free science for a free society, we need to challenge what I call epistemic apartheid in a similar way. Because you work with the neurology of living systems, and to just declare it's a beast machine by Descartes, to just say no, it's not crying in pain, it's just the screeching of a machine. I think part of that is you assume a world, you assume a machine world, you assume an inert dead world, and then you project into it according to your instruments of measurement. So to break out of that, you have to allow the democracy of knowledge to play. And true science comes out of that. It doesn't come out to tell it. I mean, what Feyerabend is speaking against is really an epistemic totalitarianism. Here's the group of privileged people, they want power, and they can get power through this method of, So to bring participation back, particularly, as he says it very beautifully in freedom, Science for a Free Society, he says the people who are impacted must be part of the discussion, because they have an expertise that others don't. They have the expertise of the pain you feel. And so they must be part, which is why, we used to have technology assessment systems. We used to have environment assessment. We sit around the table. But more important than that, over all of these years of working with local communities, I've realized that so much knowledge was just written off. They had no knowledge. The Green Revolution was pushed on us on the name that's scientific agriculture, that's modern agriculture. And all it had was chemicals, chemicals from the war. And here was really sophisticated systems of taking care of the land being written off as unscientific. Brilliant, I save seeds. Are seeds called primitive? so I started to save seeds, and we measured it. We found that, because farmers breed seed for eating, for resilience, for taste. The only purpose for industrial seed is to not renew and sell it to farmers every year. So that science of non-renewability is what's being imposed through this thing called intellectual property, So science then becomes the instrument of colonizing life on this planet. Patenting seed, in effect, is, if Descartes said animals are beast machines, intellectual property rights of seed are basically saying there was nothing before us. We created life because we define life as a machine. So the way we deal with this logjam is we want more knowledge, not less. We want more freedom in seeking more knowledge. And freedom comes from democracy, plurality, diversity. And those flows must come together. That's why we sit around the table. We sit around together and bring all of this very beautiful Indian word called Bahuda. The multiple voices. Because either you have the assumption that there are 5 great men who have knowledge and can be experts and scientists, or you work with a recognition that everything living has intelligence. All humans through life have practice and knowledge. And so then you turn everywhere where that practice and knowledge is. And we define the domain, not the hierarchy. We look for the path, not for the privilege.
There seems to be an emerging recipe here. Sounds simple, maybe naive. Help me make it less naive. So there's a table, and then there are 2 more words starting with T. We talk, and that's what we're doing now. Because if we don't talk about those things, we don't hear them, we don't think about it. And the other one, which is much harder, because we can talk, and people talk, and then they go nowhere. It's trust, which is a cousin word with truth, right? Like there has to, some sense of trust needs to be cultivated, and cultivated, pun intended, given your work, where I must come with the presupposition that what the other person, the other community, the other tradition knows and can do has a value for me. And that's a difficult, surprisingly difficult attitude to sit down in a table in order to talk. So again, how does one do that? Because we try and we fail. We often fail.
I think what comes in the way is these artificial hierarchies and sense of superiority, and that's that legacy of experts, particular people having science, the others having, when I started my work, the word that they used to use was not even unscientific. They used the word superstition.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have a beautiful tree called neem, which I started spreading it after the Bhopal disaster, which killed thousands of people. I said, here's a beautiful tree that controls pests. And then it was patented. And I fought that case for 11 years to say, but you didn't invent the pest control properties of the neem. And before they patented it, they say, the idea that neem is effective as pest control is superstition. But when they realized it works, of course, they took a patent on it. So I think the basis of trust is to not look down on anyone and not trivialize, to respect in absolute terms. That's what I did with seeds. I didn't sit around and say, as they used to have a program then with World Bank, willingness to pay. Just think of what you're willing to save in financial terms of what's, I said, no, these seeds, you can't measure them. They've disappeared because of calculating the value in the market. So we said, no, we said everything, because there's no way nature would have given this diversity. without playing a function. And the farmers wouldn't have evolved it without it having a function. So respect, respect, respect. Yeah. And from there grows trust. You know, when you respect a mountain, you trust the mountain. So I think what's eroded from our relationships, both with nature, the biodiversity of nature, other cultures, is respect. In just clear terms that, you know, you are, I respect you. And you are a condition of my being. You know, there's a lovely African word, Ubuntu, and in India, you know, we say, you are, therefore I am. So yeah, respect, but also interdependence. And then it starts changing the conversation itself. Because with hierarchy, the first thing you want to do is either wipe out the other person's thinking and knowledge, which is unfreedom.
And that could be a temptation, right, Vandana? Because you could say, in order to fight that hierarchy, I create my own, and I fight and I win. But it's a different logic. It's a different logic of confrontation we're talking about here.
Yeah, I don't think in the practical and practice and knowledge of life coming together, I don't think there's anything like fighting and winning. You know, it's what we're seeking really is going with the flows and allowing them to enrich us, you know, and making life with the flows our practice, but also our science. That's what you do. That's what I do when I say, okay, if chemicals don't work, then what kind of relationship with the soil works better? And you relate with trust, but you also relate with humility. You know, without the sense of, you know, that's I dominate, right? I know more. I have, you know, I will tell you what to do. And so that's where the whole role of, you know, I will destroy your knowledge system and force you to adopt what I am telling you. So if you look at the world, I mean, I've done this work now 50 years, forestry, rivers. You know, I'll read out in my book, Water Wars. I have a chapter on wars against rivers. Look at this. This is the philosophy of the Bureau of Reclamation, you know, which is what started building the dams in America. Isn't it? It says, the destiny of man is to possess the earth. And the destiny of the earth is to be subject to man. There can be no full conquest of the earth and no real satisfaction to humanity if large portions of the earth remain beyond his control. Only as parts of the earth are developed according to the best existing knowledge, we call science, and brought under human control, can man be said to possess the earth. The United States might accommodate its present population with its numeration, but to accommodate the whole nation, we have to conquer the earth. So there's this idea that the more violence there is, somehow we have an automatic growth, you know? And that's why I always say that this kind of dominating knowledge related to power and, you know, and violence does not give you the truth. Because if you're shrinking the earth's capacity to support all life, it's not growing. Life is not growing. Some money in some hands is growing, but the two are very different ontologically. And so we get very confused ontologically. And of course, we get into, you remember when you did the thing on the consciousness for real? And this crazy word, which I just don't understand.
You froze, or did I?
Oh.
It's Àlex that's frozen.
Yeah.
Oh, Àlex is back.
I'm back. Sorry, my connection.
Yeah.
Let me read a paragraph I had selected here from Science in a Free Society, which says, pretty much what you're saying now. So Feyerabend, to again hear his words, he says, this is how the efforts of combining flexibility and respect for all traditions will gradually erode the narrow and self-serving rationalism of those, and rationalism is in quotes, of those who are now using tax money to destroy the traditions of the taxpayers, to ruin their minds, rape their environment, and quite generally to turn living human beings into well-trained slaves of the own barren vision of life. A total activist here, but doing philosophy of science at the same time. And in the page before that, if I may add, he explains what his idea of a free society is. So he says in part 2 of this book, the idea of a free society, part 2 develops the idea of a free society and defines the role of science, in brackets, intellectuals, in it. And then he says, a free society is a society in which all traditions have equal rights and equal access to the centers of power. This differs from the customary definition where individuals have equal rights of access to positions defined by a special tradition. So he's talking about the hierarchy also there, the tradition of Western science and rationalism. And a bit below says, the theories to deal with the problems that they insinuate ever so gently, that the theories will have to be provided by specialists, intellectuals. Intellectuals determine the structure of society. Intellectuals explain what is possible and what is not. Intellectuals tell everybody what to do, but in a free society, intellectuals are just one tradition. I mean, this is a bit uncomfortable, again, because it's saying, well, those we used to believe know more than we do. There's just one more piece, not the ruling piece. So there's a sense of vertigo, like, okay, Vandana, but perhaps that comes from the lack of trust. So if now we all decide, but at the same time, there's this implicit assumption. So am I going to invite everyone really into figuring out what to do? I mean, I'm trying to express the part of me that also thinks that in that way, and understand the kind of the psychological factors behind. Perhaps it's fear. It's like, really? I mean, I know, and I think I know better. And so now to just, it sounds like a downgrade of those who have studied so much to everyone else. This is kind of the resistance. Obviously wrong.
Yeah, I think just like Feyerabend, when he said anything goes, he wasn't saying, give up knowledge, totally give up the seeking of that. What he was talking about was giving up the privileged place where a particular social practice by a particular group has been elevated to the level of science, and all other sciences and all other practices and all other knowledges have been discounted, crushed, not heard. I think the place where the conversations come in is when a group being assigned the role of expert is then given the freedom to take away others' freedom. That's where things go wrong. So yes, someone has some knowledge, gone through years of practice, but whoever gets impacted by their knowledge, they need to sit and listen to them about what that means to them. I'll give you 2 examples. As a mother, my little baby, I think it's the first time he had diarrhea. And I had to rush to a doctor. And he's prescribing things, And I'm saying, what are the medicines? He said, am I the doctor or you? I said, I'm the mother. And I said, I gave her my baby. Yeah. Yes, you must be the doctor, but I want to know. So tell me, what is this and what is this and what does it do to my baby's body? And the other was, I was asked by the Ministry of Environment of India to do a study on mining, which happened to be in the valley of my birth. So I came back from Bangalore, where I was working those days. And they wrote a typical MOU in a contract, the ugly looks of the mountains, because that's what had perturbed the Prime Minister. the ugly looks of the mountain. So I said, give me time, to discuss with communities. What is it? Is it the ugly looks, or what is the issue? So I went to the villages, and one after the other, every village, the women said, water. Now, no one had connected water and limestone mining together till that time. But we wouldn't have looked if they hadn't guided us that way, because that's what they were experiencing. They were seeing the destruction. And that's why to go where people are being impacted. And I think he has a very clear line somewhere. They must be in the dialogue. Those who are impacted must be in the dialogue, because they have an expertise of, as we say, they know where the shoe pinches. The expert can't tell you. They know where the shoe pinches. And so that then becomes the circle. Because I think another problem right now with the understanding of democracy is anyone can say anything about anything in the world, And I always say, but I never invited you into my life. So one has to know, the spaces and and the permeable boundaries, of course. They're not absolutely frozen boundaries. So one is that, and the other is all traditions. And for me, that's important, because a lot of my understanding of the narrowness of the scientific method and the domination comes from how other cultures have been impacted, my culture, And there's so many cultures. You go to Africa, every tribe has its own culture. And you cannot say their knowledge is fake. You cannot. And so therefore, the idea of post-truth and truth and all is again about practice, rootedness, and the diversity of metaphors you use to describe your work.
I see a tension here between the global and the local, right? Because
huge tension.
And a tension that's hidden in what we're taught as scientists, because the dream, at least for us physicists, right, is this sense of universality, that we will capture again those secrets of the universe, and that those secrets, once we know about them, they will apply everywhere, anytime, no matter what. It's like the power comes as well from being able to abstract that knowledge and make it irrelevant, make the conditions irrelevant. Like that's the power it has. It can apply regardless of context, but then communities are local, traditions are local. So we want something that's global, but also that doesn't wipe out the local aspect of it, which I suppose it's the other tension between what we like to call the monotheisms of the mind and a true, not just epistemic, even ontological pluralism, that they're really different ways of seeing the world, being in the world, and maybe different worlds co-inhabiting. It's so difficult.
Yeah. So, but I think it's not just the dominant Western culture and the multiplicity of other cultures, but with my work, particularly on genetic engineering and biotechnology, I realized the real scientists were working on the complexity of living organisms. They were working on the relationships. Therefore, they were looking at what is the impact of changing the genome through genetic engineering and recombinant DNA. They had the real knowledge. And I remember, there's so many reports I did at that time. The word that used to be thrown by the biotech industry and the US government, which was one, and still is one, they haven't diversified. I think that's why Feyerabend says the state science should separate. The word they kept using at us was sound science. And to write back and say, how is it sound science to call a dead molecule the master molecule that governs life? And how is it sound science to not know the complexity of the living system? How is it sound science to be blind to the impacts of your action? That's the kind of reason I got into science, to have responsibility for the consequences of what you do in the world. And these days, it's become even more crude. Follow the science. But they never elaborate what science, in whose hands with what epistemology and what ontology? Blindly, just follow the science.
Yes.
Which
Yes. And there's
science?
that we need to explain what's going on behind the scenes in a very relaxed manner. I mean, this is not about showing a dirty secret. It's just to explain to people that science is made by scientists and scientists are people, like just a sequence of obvious things, but they're non-trivial. Like science are people, and people have temperaments and different, as you know, different disciplines they're called.
Yes.
Physics and biology and so on. They're like tribes, like local peoples, and they have different values, different languages. So science is never one voice. But again, this is disturbing. Like I'm not sure people want to hear that, because it gives a sense of security to think that there's this kind of miracle of the Western mind that just produces truths and we don't need to worry about it. It's much more complicated than that, and also very simple at the end of the day. I insist, because I have, as you know, one foot within the citadel and another one outside. And I wonder, what do I need to do and what do I need to say inside and outside, so that people, lay people, as we sometimes call them, and also our fellow intellectuals just realize that, well, that's not really their job to go along with whatever they're told. I mean, it's such a privilege to be able to be paid in order to figure things out, but we're not doing it. Like, let me be a bit negative, and then I'm sure you'll kind of multiply it by -1 and make it shine, right? But I have friends who are doctors and nurses, and they tell me in the hospitals, you know, the health is not at stake. Like health, they're not healing people in hospitals anymore. It's like, all right, I know farmers. I do know farmers, a few, not so many. They close their little projects because it's so difficult to produce food that's nurturing and healthy. It's like food is not healthy anymore. It's not about health anymore. Science, which is about knowledge, it's not about knowledge anymore. It's like, what the is going on? What's going on? Are we just sabotaging our own humanity, and why?
Well, I think that's the crux of the problem, that we live in such a beautiful, rich, diverse world, culturally, ecologically, and yet this, what I call mechanistic reductionist science, first, that the world is a machine, and the second, all you need to know is the part that you're interested in. If you're interested in this particular crop, you can destroy all the other crops. That was my work on the Green Revolution. Or I'm interested in this gene, and I don't have to care for the rest. So the reductionism and mechanistic reductionism, in effect, allows you to shut the world out of your gaze. And you're seeking knowledge of the world. So you really put blinkers, It's like going into the world blind. And then with this baggage of the power of science and the rule of the expert, in spite of the, I call it the huge oceans of ignorance and tiny little specks where you go deep into a particular understanding, in those oceans of ignorance, you can't swim anymore,
Yeah.
And I think, this, just the other day, there was a lovely young neurosurgeon, very successful practice. And he left it, and he's trekking in the mountains in California. And he says, I wasn't healing people because my practice didn't allow me to go to the roots of what the problem was, why there was a problem in the back or the neck or whatever, because the system disappeared, and that's why the elephant disappeared. And then you get into that situation. Remember, as children, we learned about the 7 blind men and the elephant. Did you learn it? Yeah.
Yes.
Someone found the ears and they said it's a fan, and someone found the tail and they said it's a brush, and someone found the legs and said it's a pillar. And that's how we are groping around.
Yeah, it's kind of deadly magic trick, right? You have the whole, you concentrate on the part, and then the part just suffers because it's been isolated from the whole. And here we go, trapped in this circle. You
but
mentioned,
it's just one thing. It's even more serious because what I've watched in these 50 years with the real debates with the dominant expertise is not only do you kind of become blind to the whole, you become blind to the destruction of the whole. That's why there's never ever stepping back and saying, oh, I didn't understand this bit, let me correct myself. And so in a way, the world disappears, but knowledge disappears. This reductionist sort of scientific method kind of thing, it makes knowledge elusive. You don't even know anymore. That's why then you get things like the hard problem and the epistemic gap. If you've divided your mind and the world, and the res extensa and res cognitum, well, the two will never meet.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what you're saying here makes me think about forgetting and also forgiving, which are cousin words. But I wanted to go back to ignorance because that's so fascinating. Because what flavors of ignorance, what kinds of ignorance are we talking about? There's one ignorance which you could think it's just, well, in misfortune, bad luck, malpractice, human error, just compounding. But then there's another kind of ignorance, which is, and I don't know who said that. I think it was a famous quote, maybe it was Feynman, somebody who said that science is the pursuit. We trust the experts so that they can pursue better quality ignorance. So this is a completely different notion of ignorance. It's like a not knowing that grows, but not because of this oblivion or malpractice, but because we know more and we're just in awe with everything else that is. And then there's a third kind of ignorance, which worries me often, but we don't want to talk about that either, which is evil. How much of what we're discussing here is just some sort of bad luck, side effect of a wrong path that we cannot find a way to correct, and how much is something even more serious, which is evil, something that's trying to destroy, or a part of us that is trying to destroy the world, including ourselves.
Well, I think when indifference about the world you're part of and the practice, as well as indifference to the consequences of your action, is drowned by overwhelming pursuit of power and greed, then your concerns for life on earth, your concerns for fellow human beings are numbed.
Yeah.
To me, for human beings, that becomes evil.
Yeah.
And I think part of it, when Bacon was writing, or the earlier periods of scientific method, it was still idealistic, in the sense we will dominate, we'll have power, etc. But particularly since these technologies that allowed intervention in systems by actually denying to society the knowledge of what that intervention means and the democratic right to decide, do we want? I mean, that's why the whole GMO question became so important, because it brought basic issues to the fore. And one of the things I did was I didn't just talk to communities. I knew, as someone who was concerned about agriculture, seeds, etc., I knew how to organize well. I knew some basic ethics, but I didn't know the minutiae of how the genomic systems work. It wasn't my expertise. So I called on the people I knew who worked in genetic engineering. And I said, please teach us a non-reductionist biology.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, all you were getting was, miracles, master molecules, change one gene, you'll have miracles, everyone will have food. We'll grow food on the moon, we'll grow food on the... That's the kind of stories that used to be told on scientific platforms.
Yes.
So I just told people I knew, I said, whole class is for us, teach us more. And I think that humility is where we find new paths and creative paths. That one conference we did on post-reductionist biology actually brought together activists who knew what is wrong, but didn't know the basic science of it. And the scientists who didn't know what's going on in the real world, they had no idea. They were working with their genomes. And when the two came together, then they were supporting each other. And out of it grew new science of biosafety, new science of gene ecology, just entirely new disciplines grew, that were related to practice, but were very deeply authentic in terms of the foundations of molecular biology.
What you just said is a very beautiful example to wrap up and realize that there's a possibility of being integrative. And now you're bringing all these parts back to their place in the whole. And all of a sudden you're kind of healing those parts, which is the etymology of the word heal, which is like they become whole. Everybody has a place, including those that thought they didn't need a place. And then new things can happen. So that's also a good way to perhaps end and open it up to the rest of our friends here to contribute with their thoughts, like the idea that there's a creative power in all of it. It's not just fixing problems, because that sounds too much from that very mindset we want to transcend, right? There's a creative force at play, and we can summon it. Okay, thank you, Vandana and Eleanor.
So now we can open it up to the rest of the audience. If you would like to ask a question or come in with a comment, you can use the raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen under reactions. Todd, please come in and join the conversation.
Yes, delightful to see you, and thank you again for your time in Pari, for adding your presence to that wonderful presence. My question was, what was the era or the year roughly that you were quoting the Bureau of Reclamation, the hubris of that? Was that in the 50s, 60s, 70s? I'm just out of curiosity because I love to watch.
Which field are you talking about?
You quoted from the Bureau of Reclamation, the U.S. agency, with their arrogance.
That's when they started building the dam. So it would be in the 50s and 60s, I would imagine. Yeah.
Okay. It just sounds like the 50s. I think of that period of time as sort of maximum hubris. I'm in Alaska right now, and we had a project called Project Chariot, where they were proposing a nuclear device to build a harbor in a remote area of Alaska, regardless of the fact that people live there that did not need a harbor. There's an indigenous population, but the thinking of that era. But I would just like to emphasize the word that you utilized, humility, because these are ultimately all questions of a spiritual nature, and the humility that's absent at this point in time. But it's delightfully changing. We're talking about Feyerabend here and him putting out questions that are causing questions to sort of dismantle some of these edifices of arrogance. And one thing I'm thinking of, there's a number of folks here in this audience that are members of the organization AAPS, Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Science, and that would not have existed a couple of decades ago in title or otherwise, or be populated by so many folks of such stature that are dedicated toward not just accommodating what's going on, but just in some ways dismantling it and widening the science. And I appreciate your dedication and your life's work for doing so. And a question then is, given your proximity to some of the great battles, Monsanto and otherwise, and you've seen an evolution in how those things are being combated within, and there's a different generation. We on our grouping in Pari, it was talking primarily about the education or the evolution of consciousness. And there's so many folks now younger with a wider understanding or more deeply engaged in a wider science. From your vantage point, again, having been in the trenches, what are some of the shoots that you see that are being the most effectively used against those that are the monoliths of the past?
I think keeping the alternatives vibrant, both the alternatives of thought and knowledge, as well as practice. I think there's nothing more powerful than that. So, one of the things that got me into trouble is because I found out in my country, suddenly farmers were committing suicide. So every year we started to do a report, which used to bring out, called Suicides of Suicide, because the highest suicides were in the areas of cotton, which had become 95% Monsanto BT cotton. And I'm just editing this and updating it because my colleagues from this region just came 2 days ago to meet me. And, I had said, this is such a crude, clumsy way of thinking about the world. Just shoot a gene in with toxics in it, and it'll somehow miraculously control pests. And I said, it's not working then, it will not work now. And we need to be prepared with alternatives. And I will continue working with you. And they said 50% BT decline this year. And I had always said, it'll disappear, because these kind of, dominant, the domination of the expert over people. What troubles me a lot is this rule of experts, which now is the rule of corporations, manages to get messages out where if we don't have these kind of dialogues, people actually believe this miracle will make me a millionaire. That's the basic discussion, to become a millionaire. There's a program, I think, in America, becoming a millionaire. It moved to India. Now there's programs of making a millionaire. And then all of these tricks are brought in. You'll be a millionaire. And by the time the poor farmer finds out, he's committed suicide. So I think continuing with the practice that benefits the earth and society, as well as speaking the truth to power. And when I started, I said, I will be around in these villages till Monsanto is no more in these villages. And I can see that's going to happen.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in, Todd. Raymond.
Thank you. Thank you for this great talk. The despair that you're both expressing seems to be a metaphysical despair, and it makes me think of Shakespeare's Hamlet. I'm trained in literature. One part of us is seemingly destroying the whole of us in order to satisfy its own partial interests. And we could say the ego is trying to dominate the self, or as McGilchrist says, the left hemisphere is trying to dominate the right hemisphere in psychological terms, or in ecological terms. One part of nature, the human being, is trying to dominate and destroy the natural environment. So what Hamlet says is interesting, because he's off at Wittenberg, Germany. He's studying playwriting and philosophy, and he has to come home because his father dies. And he finds out that his father has been killed by his uncle, so his uncle can become king and also can become the wife of his mother. He doesn't find that out through scientific methods. His deceased father comes to him in the form of a ghost. So they think Hamlet's mad, but the poet Theodore Roethke says, in a dark time, the eye begins to see. And so Hamlet has quite a bit of wisdom. I just read the one sentence he says, because everything you've said today makes me think of this. And Hamlet's talking to his two friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who have been hired actually to kill him. He used his own friends to kill him. So he's talking to them, and he knows this through intuition. And he says to them, "What piece of work is a man? How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights me not." And so just to go back to the one final point about the freedom that you were talking about, a true democracy, I think, has to talk about freedom in terms of the preposition that you put after it. And by that, I mean, I think of freedom as freedom from oppression, poverty, abuse, disease, ignorance, all of those things. And yet today we've come to equate freedom with the ability to pursue whatever I want to do, irregardless of how it affects anyone else or the environment. So that's the same idea of the partiality taking over from the idea of the whole.
Thank you for reading these lines.
Thank you.
Or re-expressing what we were trying to express through literature.
Thank you. Thank you, Raymond. Well, Philip, please join us.
Yes, thank you very much for this conversation. I feel that something should be said about Goethe's approach to scientific inquiry. There's not only one scientific method. Vandana, are you able to speak to that?
Well, you know, that's why I mentioned the other mind of Europe. Actually, you know, I had a close friend who did history of science, and he wrote a book on Goethe, The Other Mind, that is totally forgotten because the mechanistic philosophy, you see, the mechanistic philosophy was designed to exploit. And I'll just read a line from another friend's book, Caroline Merchant, The Death of Nature. The removal of the interconnectedness suited the rising, that conceptual framework suited the rise of commercial capitalism very well. Whereas Goethe's learning of everything being interconnected, every part having the whole, but that thinking was the thinking of enlightened minds. You were not seeking how to grab someone else's resources. You were seeking how to evolve to your best potential. And of course, you know, the big movement of today, the organic movement, the biodynamic movement, totally inspired by Goethe, you know, the Rudolf Steiner. But you should see, I mean, it would be a perfect place to analyze this discussion we are having with the kind of attacks on biodynamic movement. You know, people who are the French head, the Italian head, constantly being sued in the courts, and always the attack unscientific. So, you know, celebrating Goethe as the real European mind is also what then connects to the multiple minds. You know, it connects so beautifully to Indian philosophy.
Thank you. Thank you. And actually, I think I'd just like to say a couple of things. One is it's a very democratic form of scientific inquiry. Anyone can approach in that way. And it's a method that's free of trying to justify or prove a hypothesis. He really argued against that. He really argued for taking in all the evidence through observation, perception, and also through practical engagement with the subject, and developing the imaginative faculties to be taught to think in the way that nature teaches us to think. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, and indeed, let me add that we may have expressed kind of the dominant views, but there are always these threads going on. They don't die, and these are the, maybe alternative is not the right word, but they exist and they survive and they even thrive. And one example in biology is the organicist movement, you know. And I'm speaking about academic biology, like those who've been raising their voices, and now it's becoming easier to just offer a view on life that it's not mechanistic and it has this more organic, very well structured and even analytical way of speaking about an organic approach to life. And another example in the neurosciences, and maybe that relates to Goethe as well, is that now that we're starting at last experience, then this becomes democratic. So thanks for the comment. This becomes democratic in its own way, because sure, we need experts again who know how to operate brain scans. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to study is experience, and we all have it. So consciousness science has this opportunity again to become truly democratic and honor the experiences of people, the everyday experiences, the anomalous experiences, the mystical experiences. So we go back to experience as the phenomenologists always did. So thanks for making this remark, because we don't need to reinvent it all. I often feel that my work is some sort of conceptual archaeology. I go and dig into what geniuses have already said, and maybe the goal is how do we put this in practice today with the conditions we're living, yeah.
Thank you.
Hans, would you like to join us?
Yes, thanks for that great conversation. I'd like to add a name to the list of wise people, and this name is Bertrand Russell. And interestingly enough, his book, The Impact of Science on Society, was printed first time in India in 1942, and he was warning of mass psychology of being the most important impact on society. And in 1942, he was warning of scientific dictatorship. And so this fits very well into the context of what has been said now. I just want to share it for everybody to know and to dig deeper. And I was confronting scientists at the biggest European chemical society, giving a lecture on raising consciousness as the precondition for scientific inquiry. And I was quoting Bertrand Russell, and all the listeners, it was a small group, and I was running a workshop, they proved that they were fully under the control of the scientific dictatorship by talking me down. I was talking about the vaccines and all the lies, but are you saying that the vaccines are not safe and effective? And I said, well, it has been proven by now, but everybody was beating me up. So this was the proof for me of scientific dictatorship at work. I just wanted to share this with you.
Thanks. And I'm surprised to hear that Bertrand Russell, right, wrote that. All right. So I'll look into it.
Thank you.
And you know, 42 was the year India gave a message to the British Empire, quit India. It's called the Quit India movement. Time for you to leave. If you don't leave on your own, we're going to drive you out. So, the fact that it was printed here first is because it was such a moment of rebelling against empire on higher principles. That is what I loved about Apapa, always on higher principles.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Richard, please come in.
Yeah, yes, thank you. My connection with you goes back to your time in Edmonton in 1998, your reference this morning to the Gandhi celebrations.
Yes.
The reference this morning to the suicide difficulties in Kerala, and I've had students work with some of the indigenous farmers through a self-organizing kind of approach rather than the standard scientific approach. And I had the privilege of an academic appointment at the Tata Institute in Bombay in the 90s. But my question really is around my study of systems goes back to the 60s. It didn't really make a lot of sense for me until I learned about Bucky Fuller's understanding of systems and what it really means to start with the holistic system and work towards the parts instead of the traditional way of starting with parts to try and figure out what adds up to the whole. And then being introduced to David Bohm's work on the ontologies of divided or undivided sort of wholeness, which one of his main books I read all the way from London to Bombay when I was heading there in the 1990s. So I'm just wondering, and also my connection a little bit with the work of Lynn Margulies. All of this sort of says that this way of thinking holistically to the parts as opposed to parts to the holistic is still very much a contentious and difficult sort of mindset to get people to really know what it means to be a whole to part thinker versus part to whole thinker. I appreciate your comments on that.
Well,
Yeah,
let me say
I
one
think,
thing.
you know, yeah, no, Àlex just talked about how, you know, these streams of knowledge, even though they've been marginalized, they are now informing an emergent science. And Lynn Margulis was quite totally silent. You know, you didn't read her, you didn't find her. And now she's bursting out. So much new work, amazing. It's just amazing, including the Gaia hypothesis, you know, the work she did on Gaia. Yeah.
Yep.
I just wanted to add here that Vandana, you said numbing a few minutes ago, and now your mentioning of Bohm, Richard, made me remember that this thought that Bohm was discussing with Krishnamurti about the difficulty of thought being proprioceptive, like, and so it all seems to come back to how we can sense, perceive the world, not be numb to the world, and at the same time not be numb to our own way of thinking, and so have this ability to kind of propriocept on how we're thinking and why we're thinking in this way. It's just, it feels like simply an exercise of kind of waking up to the world and our own worlds within. Just that. There's this quote, I think it's from Terence McKenna, but he said, like, if we could feel what we're doing, we would stop immediately. So, well, thank you for bringing Bohm and proprioception here, and then Vandana for mentioning that we are numb and we need to unnumb ourselves. Maybe that's enough.
Thank you, Richard. Sone Sone 01. Would you like to join us? You're muted.
Carlos, we cannot hear you. You're muted, Carlos.
Yes. First of all, congratulations for inviting Vandana. One of the things that has not been mentioned is that there are very few people who have the moral authority to say something about the subject. And Vandana is one of them. And I'm glad to hear her each time she speaks. And as she and Àlex have mentioned, it's important to decide who the enemy is. And I believe that the enemy is, as they mentioned, reductionism. And unless we realize that and move into let's say, an organicist approach, very little will change. The problem is not of goodwill. This is a problem of money. Scientists have become entrepreneurs. And I have seen it, let's say, firsthand, working in Boston with Jim Watson and Sidney Farber, who invented the war on cancer. That in fact invented the industry of cancer. Now, things are not that bad after all. There are two books that I highly recommend that have appeared last year and this year. One by Philip Ball called How Life Works. And the other one is by Bernd Roslenbroich, a philosopher in Germany, who wrote a book entitled The Perspective of Life. They serve, in my view, and I wrote this in a review of books in a journal called Organisms that in fact appear today. They are textbooks for people who want to learn about organicism. And I think that this is the key to change the mindset of people who have been brainwashed by the molecular biology of the cell, who have sold us a bill of goods that are based on fraud or incompetence. Therefore, I strongly recommend for everyone here, especially if you are teaching, to take a look at these two books. Again, Philip Ball, this is the University of Chicago Press, and Bernd Roslenbroich, the MIT Press. Once again, congratulations, and I enjoy very much all the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those of you who don't know Carlos, maybe you could say something about you, because you've been doing these for decades. May you say something about your work, Carlos?
Well,
because I don't want to waste the opportunity for our audience to know a little bit of your work in biology.
You see, we have been brainwashed, as I was. I mean, nobody is born with the truth in his brain or her brain. I was, let's say, brainwashed by everything that I was taught. And by studying empirical research, I realized that there were a number of myths. One of them is that the proliferation of cells is something that you induce. And for those of you who are in the field of biology, you know that there have been 2 Nobel Prizes, Rita Levi-Montalcini and Stanley Cohen, who got Nobel Prizes for growth factors that don't exist. There is no physiological thing that any growth factor does. In fact, this is a restatement of intelligent design. If you had, all of us here are in a let's say, in a state of development due to the fact that there was a single cell that started to proliferate. And as a result of that, here we are discussing this interesting subject. But all of us come from a single cell. And supposedly, nobody was around, especially the guy with the long beard, to tell the cell, proliferate. In other words, proliferation is the default state of all cells. And we have been sold this bill of goods that maintain the well-being and the standard of living of many of my colleagues, including myself, that have, let's say, enjoy a unique period in the history of science, which was the second half of the 20th century, that allowed people to build myths about, for example, cancer. There is no oncogene that produces cancer. And there are 2 Nobel Prizes that got this prize based on fraud or incompetence. So this is the magnitude of the problem that we all are discussing. And this is all based precisely on a reductionist approach that comes back from, what's his name, the guy who told us that we are the masters of nature and that we have to control it. There is nothing to control. They are controlling us.
I posted a link to your book with Anna, Carlos, for anyone who wants to read it, because there are many examples of people who've worked for decades that just turn the stone and show what's missing, or what's missed. And you're one of them. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
Hande, would you like to come in?
Sure, I'm coming in. Oops, thank you, everyone. I'm trying to show my face. Okay. I am a high school teacher without certification. I teach online in a democratic school. So I have been following party conversations, eons. I don't know if I know Àlex knows eons because I see him there. So I really need, as a high school learner and teacher, resources to bring all these conversations into. It's past time to bring into high school. I'm a bit, I always come to your resources, go to eons, and Vandana, if I may use your first name, you were here in Salt Lake City in 2016-17 at University of Utah. That's how you wouldn't remember me, of course, so many people around you. I follow your work. I'm very involved in the community, urban farming. But I'm really passionate about, I don't know how to bring what we are talking here to, it's time. We have to bring this to high school. Help me, help us. I work at an international online school, which is tiny. Yeah, help me, please help me.
Well, if I may suggest you to buy those two books, they are the basis of moving from lack of science to science. The problem is that in organicism, there is not much money. That is the problem. But I think things are changing. We will not see it perhaps, but this is unsustainable what's going on. And one more thing, I think that you are the basis of change. The change has to come much more from a lower level of complexity than the graduate school. High school, even let's say grammar school should start. In other words, you have to encourage young people to ask stupid questions. That is the solution.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing, I'll shut up. The students I'm engaged with are amazing. They are my hope. This school is unschooled students. There are unschooled students, like the educators, unschooling. There is a movement around the world for years, right? But it's a very tiny percentage. There is that potential. I'm so excited, but the dealing, in my humble opinion, is these connections. It's even hard for me to reach out to you at this moment, at this point. I gained the courage to speak to you. You talked about this earlier in terms of expertism, right? There's that divide. Yeah.
Thank you.
Perhaps, Vandana, you could wrap it up talking about what a seed is, because I think this is one of the most beautiful things I've heard you say, and I think it fits, or just close it in whatever way you see fit, but seeds, that we're talking about seeds, planting seeds.
The young people are the seeds of the future, but it's really working on seed that I've seen very closely how the idea of a standard, so-called scientific method, because till 30, 40 years ago, most of the seeds of the world were in the hands of farmers. They were renewable, they multiplied, they were diverse. And then the industry found there was money in this, so they rewrote biology, to make us think seeds don't renew. They took life out of the seed. And I remember meeting in 87, where the industry laid out, they said by the time we are finished, seed will be seen as a machine that we invented. I said, by the time I'm finished, people will realize the seed is living. And through the seed, we learn everything Carlos just mentioned about sciences of living systems. Because, the ultimate autopoiesis is the seed itself. And in a way, it counters everything about mechanistic thinking. And you know, when I started to do the work on the Green Revolution, it was only about selling chemicals, changing the seed, because the seed didn't adapt to the chemicals. And the native seeds were tall and they lost, won't go into the detail. But the interesting thing was, I said, wow, these seeds know how to rebel, you know? We call it the satyagraha, the force of truth. I said, these seeds live for their truth. And they said, we don't want these chemicals that are going to destroy the soil and turn us into monocultures and destroy our diversity. Of course, since that time, we know it's also the root of the whole climate pollution havoc. And so I think turning to the seed to de-brainwash ourselves, Carlos said, you know.
Good.
What is, you know, who has the expertise? Shooting a gene in the dark is not expertise about seed. It's expertise about shooting. And then friends have shown me how the clones they create out of this, the majority of them are actually monsters. They don't admit that because one of the things with the science of domination is you hide errors, you hide unpredictability, you offer predictability and total control, that whole idea of total control. And the seed just changes the narrative. And, you know, all of you, seeds of a different way of thinking, knowing from your experiences, and that is the seeking of truth.
Yes, yes. And that very beautifully kind of heals the accusation of Feyerabend that he's the worst enemy of science, because it's in showing the vulnerabilities of science that we also get its strength, as opposed to trying to hide them and pretend they're not there. Then it's when we make science weaker, democracy weaker, and societies weaker. So thank you for this understanding through seeds, Vandana.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone who joined.
Yes, thank you, Àlex, and thank you, Vandana. And thank you, everybody who came here today and joined us at the Pari Center. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you for
Thank you.
joining.
Bye-bye.